Welcome to the hidden corners where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind. Welcome to the Wolfman Chronicles. Clay is out of town this week, and my son Jack is back at his home, so that means you're stuck with me this week. And I have a bit of a cold, so I will do my best to read this story, and Clay will be back next weekend, so you only have to put up with me this 1 week. But anyway, we are reading Book 6 of the Wolfman Chronicles. This is episode 67. We are on Chapter 3, The Summoning of Evil, Werewolves in Ireland. And this episode takes place on Achill Island. The howling wind rattled the windows of the fisherman's cottage, its mournful cries carrying the echoes of the storm outside. A sudden burst of wind blew the door closed, and the small lantern on the kitchen table blew out, leaving the room in stark darkness. Sasha screamed, jolted by the sudden explosion of sound. Jack instinctively reached for her and pulled her close as he fumbled for the light switch. "The power's out. There's no electricity. Where'd we put those matches?" he asked Sasha, groping his way in the dark towards the cabinet above the stove. Sasha pulled out her phone and quickly turned on the flashlight, illuminating the small kitchen. "They're on the mantel, above the fireplace," she replied. Jack located the small box and relit the oil lamp. He opened the back door and peered outside, but there was no sign of the tall man. He had vanished into the dark night. He made sure the door was locked and the deadbolt was in place. Then he proceeded to build a fire. "What are we going to do, Jack?" Sasha asked, worry deeply etched across her brow. Jack looked at her thoughtfully. "Let's pour through those books you got today and see if we can find any information there. And tomorrow we need to find someone on this damn island that is willing to help us. Someone who knows the history and can tell us what the hell is going on here." Jack poked at the growing fire, the orange flames casting flickering shadows across the walls of the fisherman's cottage. The storm outside raged on, the wind howling like a living thing. Sasha sank into one of the worn armchairs by the fire as Jack grabbed the stack of books they had picked up earlier from the small, cluttered bookshop in the village. "Here," Jack said, dropping a leather-bound volume into Sasha's lap. The title, faintly embossed in gold, read Ancient Myths of Achill Island. "Start with this one. Maybe we can figure out what Ligdom means beyond just a translation." Sasha poured through the pages as Jack flipped through the other books, reading the titles and back covers. Not sure of where to begin, he picked up his phone and searched Irish translation of Ligdom. "It says here that Ligdom means leave me or let me, but here's something that's interesting. There's a phrase, Ligdom agus ligfi me duit, which means, let me be and I will let you be. That sounds like as good an explanation as any." Jack leaned back against the fireplace, the firelight catching the wolfish glint in his eyes. "But what I don't understand is why we're being targeted. We only came here for some rest and exploration. Why do they think we're trying to interfere? And who is telling us to leave?" A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows again, and Sasha's gaze darted toward the darkened panes. The storm wasn't letting up, and the feeling of being watched hadn't faded since the moment that figure had vanished from the back door. "I'm going to make some hot tea. Would you like some?" Sasha asked as Jack lifted up a volume of Tales of the Emerald Isle. He nodded, and a few minutes later, Sasha returned with 2 hot, steaming mugs of chamomile tea. Jack glanced up from the book he was reading. According to this book, the head of an animal may be thrown over a roof or left on the doorstep of a house to ward off evil. "Okay," Sasha replied as she sat the tea down on the table in front of Jack. "I get that someone thinks we're evil, so they've left us a sheep's head on our doorstep, but it doesn't explain who did it or why." Jack stared at his book, his fingers drumming on the table as the fire crackled behind him. "I feel like we're missing something, that something's just beyond our reach of understanding." Sasha wrapped her hands around her steaming mug of tea, her gaze flicking toward the locked back door. The thought of the sheep's head sitting just outside made her stomach churn. "But who even knows we're here? We've barely spoken to anyone since we arrived, and we haven't done anything to upset anyone or draw attention to ourselves." Jack rubbed the back of his neck, his frustration evident. "It's not about upsetting someone. It's about where we are, Sasha. This island's got a history, and whatever's happening here, we've stumbled right into the middle of it." Sasha picked up her book and began reading. "Jack, listen to this. Here's a tale about the werewolves of Ossory." She began to read out loud. "The moon callers who walked the forests of old Ireland. Ancient Ireland was said by some to have been plagued by a particularly large and fierce breed of wolf, and men would sometimes go to war with them or call them to war alongside heroes and champions. They were even so bold as to attack villages and towns, and a great pack of them assailed Coleraine in the year 1650. To battle these fierce wolves of great cunning and speed were bred the Irish wolfhounds, a mighty breed of dog which can grow to the height of a man's shoulders. But older stories yet claim that wolfhounds weren't bred to hunt wolves at all, but a darker sort of beast, which was part wolf and part man. The ancient book written by Irish monks, Cur Onman, recounted the spoken histories of the druids and bards who remembered the lines of kings and spoke of a prince called Faoladh, whose brother Faoladh was the first king of Ossory. His children and all the people of his tribe could, from that day forward, change themselves into wolfen form and raid the herds and homes of their enemies, going a-wolfing, as it was known, devouring cattle and people with equal lust. It is for this reason that the wolf's head became the banner of Ossory of old. And when an Osorian lived as a wolf, their human body lay still and cold at home, as if though dead. When they were about to change into a wolf, strict orders were given to friends not to touch or move the human body, for if it was moved to a place where the returning spirit could not find it, then the person was doomed to remain in wolf form for the rest of their life. An even older legend recounts how 3 werewolf women came forth from a cave once a year during the harvest feast to slaughter sheep and other livestock, and who were finally lured to their doom by music and massacred. So seriously were these stories taken that they even came to the attention of the Vatican and received the seal of Pope Urban III, perhaps the first ever tale of the werewolf recorded in Christendom. For it was in 1182 that a priest by the name of Giraldus Cambrensis, or Gerald of Wales, as he was known, royal clerk to the British king, was making his way from the north in Ulster down into Meath, as he was exploring the country and writing it all down in his Topographia Hibernica. He stopped to rest for the night, and after darkness had wrapped itself about the world, and the fire was burning down to embers, what should he hear but a gruff, throaty voice echoing out of the darkness, asking him to walk into the forest. Well, he would not, and he was terrified out of his wits with it, but after he calmed down a bit, he convinced the speaker to step forward into the light and be seen, and what should emerge but a mighty wolf of yellow fang and gray fur. This wolf told Giraldus that he was an accursed son of the tribe of Ossory, who had been damned to send forth 2 of their number every 7 years in the form of a wolf by Saint Natalis of Kilkenny, son of Angus mac Nafree, king of Munster, 600 years before. As wolves they would stay and live for 7 years, until they returned home to be replaced by another couple. Well, when Giraldus heard this, he was greatly troubled, for having read the writings of Natalis, he knew him to be a strict and unbending man of God, who would brook no deviation from his own interpretations of God's law. And of course, being long dead, the curse could never be lifted. The wolf, who didn't give his name, told the priest that his wife had been wounded by hunters, and was in her death throes not far off, and since they were both Catholics, they'd like if he'd come and hear her last confession. And so he went, after some persuasion, to a nearby cave and found a she-wolf, who spoke in turn and gave her confession and received the viaticum before passing away. And when she did, she turned back into an old woman, to the astonishment of Giraldus. Before he wrote to his bishop and thence to the Pope, Giraldus reflected on the words of St. Augustine, who also spoke of shapeshifters. We agree then with Augustine that neither demons nor wicked men can either create or really change their natures, but those whom God has created can, to outward appearance, and by his permission, become transformed, so that they appear to be what they are not, the senses of man being deceived and laid asleep by a strange illusion, so that things are not seen as they really exist, but are strangely drawn by the power of some phantom or magical incantation to rest their eyes on unreal and fictitious forms. Although no wolf has walked the dark forests and remote hills of Ireland for many a long year, at least that we know of, still you can travel to where Ossory once stood. Sasha put her book down on her lap and glanced at Jack. I think someone knows, or at least suspects, that we're part werewolf. Jack nodded. Oh, I think they know. That mysterious tall guy that keeps showing up and wants us to leave. The red-haired woman who tried to warn us that someone was after us. The wolf that appeared at the ruins. That piece of paper with the wolf's head on it. And now this carved wolf amulet that someone left on our kitchen table. Even the folks at the pub act strangely around us. I think there's something going on here, and I think the whole town is in on it. Sasha suddenly put her tea down on the table and stood up. Remember the old man from the diner this morning, the one we met later walking up the road? Didn't he say something about not visiting the ruins tonight? Yes, you're right, Jack exclaimed. He specifically told us not to go to the ruins tonight. I'd forgotten all about that. But it's awfully stormy outside. Well, I'm up for a walk if you are, Sasha replied. The wet gravel crunched under their boots as Jack and Sasha trudged along the narrow, winding road towards Sleevemore Mountain. The fog clung to them like a shroud, and the faint glow of Jack's flashlight barely pierced the dense mist. It was near midnight, and the rain had finally let up, leaving a thick fog that hung low to the ground. As they neared the base of the mountain and began the lilting ascent up the path that led to the ruins of the deserted village, Jack noticed the eerie silence that hung in the air. The usual sound of waves crashing in the distance was conspicuously absent. Sasha shivered, though she wasn't sure if it was from the cold or the growing sense of unease curling in her stomach. The dark shapes of the crumbling stone walls jutted out from the earth like broken teeth as the ruins came into view, their edges softened by centuries of wind and rain. Jack turned off his flashlight, plunging them into darkness. The faint glow of the moon struggled to break through the fog, casting an otherworldly glow over the ruins. They found an outcropping of rock which provided a small amount of shelter from the mist, while giving them a view of the surrounding hillside. A sound broke the silence, a faint crunching of gravel. Someone else was already here. Jack's eyes narrowed as he scanned the ruins. The darkness and the fog prevented him from seeing very far, yet the sound of the footsteps appeared to be coming from the direction of the old stone buildings. Sasha's grip on his arm tightened, and they crouched low to the ground to prevent being seen. More footsteps could be heard coming up the path that Jack and Sasha had just been on, yet they continued on past the rocks, where Jack and Sasha lay close to the ground, quietly observing. Someone had built a fire in the center of one of the old ruined buildings, and as the fire blazed, Jack and Sasha could see several figures in long dark cloaks standing in a circle around the fire. More were still coming up the path. The flames from the fire flickered and danced, casting grotesque, elongated shadows across the crumbling stone walls. The figures surrounding the fire were eerily silent, their cloaks swaying slightly as they slowly circled the fire. As more cloaked individuals emerged from the mist, they moved with deliberate, almost synchronized steps, each one taking their place in the growing circle around the fire. Jack's breath hitched as one of the figures raised a hand, signaling for attention. The others immediately stopped, their stillness almost unnatural, like statues frozen in time. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the faint rustling of the wind. Then a low, droning hum began to rise from the circle, building slowly and reverberating through the ruins. It was a sound that seemed to vibrate in the very air, primal and haunting, sending chills down Sasha's spine. She pressed herself closer to Jack, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure who raised their hand stepped forward, closer to the fire, and pulled back their hood. The face beneath was obscured by a mask, intricately carved and painted, its design resembling a wolf with hollow eyes that glinted in the firelight. From beneath their cloak, the leader produced an object, a large weathered stone etched with ancient runic symbols that seemed to glow a faintly fluorescent green in the fire's light. The hum from the circle grew louder, shifting into a rhythmic chant that rose and fell like the tide. The language was unfamiliar, guttural and melodic, as if it had been pulled from the depths of time itself. As the leader raised the stone high above their head, the fire roared higher, its flames turning a deep, unnatural green. The circle of figures raised their arms in unison, each holding a similar stone, though smaller and less elaborate. Their chanting reached a crescendo, echoing off the ruins and into the foggy night. Jack's eyes were locked on the fire, his muscles tense. He could feel it, a pulsing energy radiating from the ritual, something ancient and powerful that seemed to resonate with the wild, primal part of him. Suddenly the leader slammed the stone onto the ground in front of the fire, shattering it into pieces. The chant ceased abruptly, plunging the ruins into an eerie silence. The fire dimmed for a moment before flaring back to life, revealing something new within the circle, a shape that hadn't been there before. It was a figure, hunched and unnatural, its form flickering like a mirage in the firelight. Sasha gasped, her fingers gripping Jack's arm. "Jack, what is that?" Jack's jaw tightened, his instincts screaming at him to run, to protect Sasha, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the grotesque figure. It moved with an unnatural grace, its limbs bending in ways that defied logic. As the cloaked figures bowed their heads in unison, the hunched figure turned toward the path Jack and Sasha had just come from, and they could see its hollow, glowing eyes scanning the mist-covered hillside. "It's looking for something," Jack whispered, his voice low and tense. "Or someone," Sasha added, her breath hitching as the figure took a step forward, its gaze locking onto the outcropping of rock where they hid. The hunched figure began moving toward the outcropping, its flickering form gliding rather than walking, as if it wasn't entirely bound by the physical world. Jack's instincts flared with urgency. He grabbed Sasha's arm, his voice barely a whisper. "We need to move, now!" Sasha nodded, her wide eyes locked on the creature as it closed the distance with alarming speed. Keeping low, they crept along the uneven ground, their boots crunching softly on the wet gravel. Jack led them toward a gap in the ruins, hoping the fog would conceal their retreat. Behind them, the chanting resumed, softer now, but with a sinister undertone, as though the ritual was far from over. The flames flared again, and Jack glanced back just in time to see the hunched figure pause, tilting its misshapen head as though listening. Then it let out a guttural, otherworldly screech that sent shivers down his spine. They broke into a run, dodging between crumbling walls and moss-covered stones. The fog clung to them like a second skin, obscuring their path and making every step treacherous. The guttural screech echoed again, closer this time, and Jack risked another glance back. The figure was pursuing them, its grotesque form illuminated by the faint glow of the ritual fire. It moved unnaturally fast, its limbs twisting and stretching as it bounded over the uneven terrain. "This way!" Jack hissed, pulling Sasha toward a narrow pathway that sloped downward, away from the ruins. The sound of rushing water reached their ears, a stream cutting through the hillside, fed by the recent rain. As they waded into the icy water, Sasha glanced back toward the ruins. The chanting was growing fainter, but she could still see the otherworldly green glow of the fire through the fog. The creature, or whatever it was retreating, and they watched as it made its way back to the group. "What was that thing, Jack? It definitely wasn't human. It's like it came from the fire. Like they summoned it." Jack shook his head, his expression grim. I don't have any idea, but I don't like the looks of this. I think whatever they're doing up there, whatever they're summoning, it's dangerous. Not just to us, but to this whole island. We need to find out more about this ritual. The sound of the chanting faded as Jack and Sasha moved further from the ruins, but the unease lingered like a shadow. They stuck to the stream for a while, using its twisting path to obscure their trail. Eventually they emerged onto a narrow dirt road which led back to town. "Where do we even start?" Sasha asked, her voice barely above a whisper as they paused to catch their breath. The fog had thickened, turning the world into an impenetrable gray void. Jack rubbed a hand over his face, his wet hair clinging to his forehead. "The old man at the diner. He warned us about tonight. He must know something." Sasha nodded, determination hardening her expression. "Right. We'll find him. He's probably our best chance at getting some answers." They made their way back through the village, heading home. A faint glow from the streetlights cast long shadows across the cobblestones. By the time they reached the old fisherman's cottage, the fog had thinned, and the moon's reflection ebbed on the surface of the water, gently lapping at the beach. The next morning, the diner was buzzing with conversation and laughter as Jack and Sasha entered, yet all eyes turned and watched as they sat and ordered their breakfast. "What'll you have today?" the waitress asked, courteous and yet guarded. Sasha inquired about the gentleman who had spoken to them the previous day and asked if Rosie might know how he could be reached. She explained that they were just looking for someone who might know some of the local stories of the town, and he had seemed quite approachable. "Aye, that would be Eamon. He lives at the far edge of town, near the cliffs. He's not one for visitors, but if anyone knows the old stories, it's him. Just be careful. He's got his reasons for keeping to himself." Thanking Rosie, the waitress, Jack and Sasha set off toward Eamon's cottage. The fog was thicker near the cliffs, swirling like ghostly tendrils as they followed the narrow path. The sound of waves crashing against the rocks below echoed in the distance, a reminder of the island's wild nature. Eamon's cottage appeared suddenly through the mist, a squat, weathered structure that looked as though it had grown out of the rocky ground. Light flickered from a single window, and a faint wisp of smoke curled from the chimney. Jack knocked firmly on the door. "Eamon, we need to talk to you. It's about the ruins." For a long moment there was silence. Then the door creaked open, just enough for the pale, weathered face to appear. Eamon's sharp blue eyes studied them with suspicion. "You shouldn't be here," he said gruffly. "Go home. Go back where you came from." "Eamon, please," Sasha said, stepping forward. "We need to know what's going on." Eamon's expression darkened, and he started to close the door, but Jack wedged his hand against it. "Please," he said, "we're not here to cause trouble. We just want to talk with you." Jack paused, wondering how much he should tell this man. "We saw the ritual last night. We saw what they summoned. We think the island is in danger, and we want to help, if we can." Eamon hesitated, his gaze flicking between them before he finally sighed and opened the door wider. "You don't know what you're meddling in," he muttered. "But if you've already seen it, there's no turning back now." The inside of the cottage was cluttered but warm, with books and trinkets filling every available surface. Eamon motioned for them to sit by the fire and poured them cups of strong, bitter tea. "They call themselves the Keepers," Eamon began, settling into a worn chair across from them. Their bloodlines go back centuries, tied to the old ways of this island. The ruins you wandered into, they're more than just stones. They're a gateway." "A gateway to what?" Jack asked, leaning forward. "To the other world," Eamon replied, his voice heavy. "A place where the veil between this world and the next is thin. The keepers protect it, or so they claim, but their methods, they've grown darker over the years." Sasha frowned. "And the thing they summoned? That guardian spirit?" Eamon nodded. "A Kangloros. It's meant to ward off intruders, to keep the gateway safe. But it doesn't just follow the keeper's commands. It has a will of its own, and if it senses a threat—" He trailed off, his gaze hardening. "He won't stop until that threat is gone." Jack exchanged a glance with Sasha. "Why would they think we're a threat? We're just visitors." Eamon's eyes narrowed. "You were in the ruins tonight. That's enough for them. The keepers don't take chances, not when it comes to the gateway, and now that the Kangloros has seen you, it won't rest." "Then how do we stop it?" Sasha asked, her voice urgent. Eamon hesitated, his expression grim. "There's only one way to banish a Kangloros, close the gateway, but doing that, it'll bring you face to face with the keepers, and they won't let you interfere without a fight." Jack leaned back, the firelight casting sharp shadows across his face. "Well then, we'd better prepare. Tell us everything we need to know." Eamon rose from his chair and began rummaging through a cluttered shelf, pulling out a battered, leather-bound book and an old map of the island. He spread the map on the table, pointing to a faint mark near the ruins. "Here," he said, "this is where the gateway lies, deep beneath the ruins. It's been hidden for centuries, but the keepers know its location." Jack leaned over the map, studying the jagged contours and faint markings. "How do we get down there without being caught?" Eamon shook his head. "You don't. The keepers guard it day and night. If you're going to stop them, you'll need more than just courage. You'll need to understand what you're dealing with." He tapped the leather book. "This contains the old rites and lore of the island. It might help you if you can decipher it." Sasha picked up the book, its pages worn and filled with intricate symbols and dense handwriting. "We don't have much time," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "That thing, they've summoned it, and it's already hunting us." Eamon nodded gravely. "The Kangloros is bound to the gateway. If you're near it, it will find you. You'll need to be prepared to face it." Jack stood, determination hardening his features. "Then we start tonight. We'll study the book, learn what we can, and figure out how to close that gateway." Eamon hesitated, his gaze flicking toward the darkened window. "Be careful. If you fail, it won't just be you the keepers and the Kangloros come after. The island's balance depends on that gateway staying closed." A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, and the fire in the hearth flared before dimming, casting long shadows across the room. Sasha shivered, pulling her raincoat tighter. "Whatever's happening," she said softly, "it feels like we're running out of time." Jack nodded, his jaw set. "We'll need supplies and a plan. Eamon, will you help us?" Eamon's shoulders sagged under the weight of years of secrets and fear. Finally, he gave a reluctant nod. "Aye, I'll help you, but you'll need to move quickly. The keepers won't wait for long, and the Kangloros won't stop until it's taken you." As the firelight flickered and the storm outside began to build again, Jack and Sasha exchanged a glance. They were no longer just visitors on a holiday. They were caught in a battle as old as the island itself. Thank you for listening to this week's episode, and I hope it wasn't too bad. I had difficulty reading it with a stuffy nose. I hope you'll join us next week for another installment of the Wolfman Chronicles. And until then, have a great week, everyone.